In the summer of 1985, a wedding meant to unite two families became the beginning of a decades-long mystery when the bride and groom vanished without a trace, their car gone, their bodies missing, their love story swallowed by the silence of Savannah's moss-draped streets and whispering oaks. For 13 years, no one knew what happened to Jasmine Bell and Caleb Hart, until a sunken car, a half-buried secret, and a grieving mother's unrelenting search turned a cold case into a firestorm of buried truths, generational power, and ultimate justice. This is not just a story about disappearance. It's a story about legacy, about silence, about a love so dangerous it threatened an empire, and the voices, those silenced for too long, finally rising. Welcome to nestsoul. Welcome to the Vanishing Vows. The summer air in Savannah, Georgia, was thick with jasmine and old secrets the day Jasmine Bell married Caleb Hart. Beneath the shadow of Spanish moss and stained glass windows, they said their vows inside St. Augustine's Chapel, a modest church that stood in quiet defiance of the opulence surrounding it. The bride wore a lace dress hand-sewn by her mother, Marcia, and the groom, a tall, broad-shouldered man with storm-gray eyes, stood at the altar in a crisp navy suit gifted by his father, Richard Hart, a man who gave nothing without expecting it back double. The wedding was small, tasteful, and tense beneath its surface. While Jasmine glowed with the innocence of young love, the Hart family exuded discomfort like perfume, too expensive, too much, and suffocating. Sylvia Hart, Caleb's mother, wore a smile stretched taut as violin strings, and Richard, silent and grim, shook hands like he was closing business deals rather than congratulating a son. There were whispers in the pews, murmurs about class, lineage, and whether Jasmine, a girl raised in a two-bedroom home by a single mother who worked double shifts at Memorial Health, truly belonged in the Hart family tree. But the couple didn't care. Not then. After the ceremony, they drove away in a lemon-yellow Chevy Camaro, a wedding gift from Richard that gleamed in the sun like a beacon, bright, bold, and out of place on Jasmine's modest street. Neighbors waved as they passed, and Jasmine's laughter floated from the window like wind chimes caught in a breeze. That was the last time anyone saw them. At first, no one panicked. They were young, in love, and it was their honeymoon. Days passed, then a week, then 10. Phones rang with no answer. Hotel bookings showed they'd never checked in. Caleb didn't show up to his new job at Hart Enterprises, and Jasmine didn't return to the small dental clinic where she'd worked reception. Marcia filed a missing persons report. Richard hired a private investigator, for appearance's sake, Marcia would later say, but openly speculated that Jasmine had manipulated Caleb into running away, possibly to start a new life elsewhere. The Camaro, he noted coldly, had been in her name. They'll surface when the money runs out, he told reporters, if they're not already in the Caribbean. But no bank accounts were touched, no passports used, no sightings confirmed. For 13 years, Jasmine and Caleb Hart were simply gone, a love story that evaporated. Marcia clung to fragments, a strand of hair on Jasmine's brush, the wedding photo where Jasmine looked over her shoulder and beamed at the camera, and the way her daughter always signed her cards with a hand-drawn heart in place of the dot in her eye. She never believed her daughter left of her own will. Not Jasmine, not without goodbye. Every year on their anniversary, she lit a candle. Every year she kept her number active in case someone, anyone, called. The case went cold, sealed inside dusty boxes in a municipal evidence room until fate, or maybe justice, cracked the lid open again. It started in 1998 when a group of environmental science students at the University of Georgia analyzed decades-old satellite images of the Okefenokee Swamp. Their goal had been innocuous, tracking land erosion and wetland shrinkage. But in a blurred image dated late summer 1985, one student named Elijah Quinn noticed a strange yellow shape where there should have been only water and sedge. Enhancing the image revealed more. It was angular, metallic, partially submerged, but distinct. A vehicle. Intrigued, they cross-referenced the location with local missing persons reports from that year. That's when Jasmine and Caleb's names resurfaced, and the Camaro. Authorities were alerted. Sonar confirmed a large object buried deep beneath layers of silt and peat in an isolated inlet of the swamp, off-path, unmarked, nearly inaccessible without a boat and an understanding of the terrain. It took 4 hours, 3 agencies, and a helicopter to lift the vehicle from its aquatic grave. The Camaro's paint had faded, algae clung to the undercarriage, and its windows were thick with grime. but the license plate, a custom design with the initials C+J85, was still legible. Detective Elena Marquez, now leading the cold case unit, made the call to Marcia Bell. It was mid-morning when the phone rang, interrupting Marcia's quiet routine of watering houseplants and avoiding hope. Her hands trembled as she picked up. "Mrs. Bell, this is Detective Marquez with the Savannah Police Department. We have located a vehicle in the Okefenokee Swamp registered to your daughter. I'm going to need you to come with us." Marcia's knees nearly buckled. Her grocery list slipped from her fingers. She hadn't heard Jasmine's name from an official source in over a decade. Did you find—" Her voice cracked, and the question hung unanswered. All she heard was the hum of silence on the line, pregnant with the weight of possibility. She was told to meet them at a remote ranger station near the swamp's entrance. She didn't even change clothes. Just grabbed her keys and drove, eyes dry but heart unraveling. The world outside blurred into watercolor. Cypress trees dripping with moss, the golden haze of sun hitting water, dragonflies cutting through the air like forgotten angels. When she arrived, there were already barricades, flashing lights, and a crowd. Her breath caught when she saw it. Sitting on a flatbed trailer, like some relic returned from the dead, the yellow Camaro, her daughter's last chariot. The moment she saw it, Marcia knew. Jasmine hadn't run. She hadn't eloped to escape poverty or fled out of fear. Something had happened. Something monstrous. And somehow, the truth had been waiting all this time, just beneath the waterline, waiting for someone to look closer, to not forget. And Marcia Bell had never, ever forgotten. The air inside the Environmental Sciences Lab at the University of Georgia buzzed with the low hum of computers and the occasional scrape of chair legs across tile. It was late spring, 1998, and Elijah Quinn, a wiry junior with perpetual bedhead and a coffee addiction, sat hunched over his workstation, scrolling through decades-old satellite images of the Okefenokee Swamp. The assignment had been simple: analyze land transformation in Georgia's wetlands over the last 50 years. Most students found it tedious. Elijah found it mesmerizing. There was something haunting about watching rivers shift, forests retreat, and man's encroachment spread like mold. But today, something else caught his eye. In an image from August 1985, a strange yellow shape sat in the upper corner of one satellite frame, irregular, angular, out of place. He frowned, zooming in. The resolution was grainy, but the object was definitely metallic, partially submerged, tucked near a patch of dense brush where the swamp opened briefly into a shallow lagoon. "Amber, come look at this," he called across the room. Amber Salazar, the top student in the class and unofficial group leader, slid over in her chair. She squinted at the screen. "Looks like a car?" "That's what I thought," Elijah said. "But there's no road access within miles of that point. No logging paths, no ranger trails. The only way to get there is by boat." "We need to cross-check missing persons reports," Amber said, eyes alight. "Maybe someone drove in and never came out." Within an hour, they had pulled up old newspaper clippings from the Savannah Herald. A wedding photo made the front page in August 1985. A young couple, beaming, standing beside a lemon-yellow Chevy Camaro with C+J85 on the license plate. The headline, "Heart Heir and Local Bride Vanish After Ceremony." "No way," Elijah whispered. They printed the article, marked the coordinates of the satellite anomaly, and wrote a report that ended with a single sentence. "We believe this object may be linked to the disappearance of Jasmine Bell and Caleb Hart." Their professor, Dr. Lorraine Meeks, took one look at the report and made a phone call to the Savannah Police Department that same afternoon. Within 48 hours, Detective Elena Marquez was at the university, examining their findings firsthand. She didn't speak much as Amber walked her through the overlays, but her eyes never left the screen. When they finished, she looked up and said quietly, "Do you realize what you might have just uncovered?" "Is it really them?" Amber asked. "That's what we intend to find out," the detective replied. The swamp was remote, but Elena's team mobilized quickly. With help from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources and a marine recovery unit, they deployed sonar scans to confirm the object beneath the water. It was large, metallic, car-shaped. A barge with a crane was brought in. A chopper hovered nearby, its blades slicing through the muggy air. Journalists caught wind and began arriving. The swamp became a stage, and then the Camaro rose. Algae clung to its windows. Mud oozed from the wheel wells. The license plate, unbelievably, had survived the years. C+J85. Elena ordered the area sealed off. No one in or out. The car was placed on a flatbed, still dripping. They opened the trunk. Nothing. No bodies. No signs of blood. Just a single silver lighter on the passenger seat engraved with the initials CH. She made the call to Marcia Bell herself. "We've located a vehicle registered to your daughter," she said, voice calm but firm. "We'd like you to come in." When Marcia arrived at the ranger station near the swamp's border, her presence drew quiet stares. There was something haunting about a mother walking toward the last known link to her child. She approached the Camaro as if approaching a coffin. Her hand trembled as she reached out, fingertips grazing the frame. "She loved this car," she whispered, said it looked like sunshine on wheels. Elena stood beside her, giving space. "We didn't find any remains," she said gently, "but this confirms they were here. We're reopening the case." From behind them, a voice rang out. "That's my son's car." Richard Hart had arrived. He was dressed in an immaculate gray suit, his salt and pepper hair slicked back, eyes hidden behind sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Beside him stood his wife Sylvia, pale and tight-lipped, and Ethan, their younger son, who looked down at the vehicle as if seeing a ghost. "License plate matches," Richard said to no one in particular. "Custom ordered. Gift from me." Marcia turned to face him, voice brittle. "You said she lured him away. Said she ran with your son to escape her nothing life." "She did," Richard replied coolly. "And now we know where they ended up." "You don't know anything," Marcia shot back, "except how to erase people who don't meet your standards." "That's enough," Elena interjected, stepping between them. "We're not here to argue. We're here to investigate." But something in Richard's face, too smooth, too practiced, sent a chill through Marcia's spine. This man wasn't surprised. He was irritated, inconvenienced, like a man being asked to relive a mess he thought long buried. And Marcia, watching him closely, knew then what her heart had long whispered. Someone didn't want Jasmine to be found. But the swamp had given her back, and the truth, whatever it was rising with her. Marcia Bell didn't remember driving home. The road between the Okefenokee and her modest townhouse in downtown Savannah was a familiar one, but that day, the world outside her windshield had blurred into a haze of reflections and fragments. Yellow paint flaking off steel, the glint of a license plate, and Richard Hart's impassive face as he stood beside the vehicle like it was an old briefcase he hadn't seen in years. Inside her home, silence roared. The air felt heavy, tinged with jasmine and dust, the scent of a memory too stubborn to die. She dropped her keys on the counter and walked the short hallway to the one room she had avoided for 13 years. Jasmine's. The doorknob resisted, as if the house itself wished to keep the room sealed. When she pushed it open, time collapsed. It was still the same, faded floral wallpaper, the white desk with a crooked leg, a stack of teenage romance novels beside a pink lamp with a fraying shade. Jasmine's favorite sundress was still draped across the back of the chair, untouched since the morning she'd worn it to the bridal fitting. The room smelled musty now, the air stale from grief and unopened windows. Marcia moved like a ghost, touching objects with fingers made of memory. Her hand trembled over the compact on the vanity, the lipstick still bearing Jasmine's fingerprint. The shoes kicked lazily under the bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs creaking in protest. And then, something shifted inside her. This wasn't just a shrine, it was evidence. The detective had said they were reopening the case. That meant they'd need context, insight, artifacts. Jasmine's world was frozen here, and Marcia realized she might be the only one left who remembered how it all truly looked, how it smelled, what was where. She stood, fetched cardboard boxes from the garage, and began to pack with the gentle hands of a mother dressing a sleeping child. That was when she found it. Tucked deep in the closet, behind old scarves and a pair of worn dance shoes, was a man's watch, too large for Jasmine's wrist, and a University of Georgia sweatshirt, size large, still faintly smelling of cologne. Caleb's. Her breath caught. She'd always suspected that Jasmine and Caleb had occasionally stayed over before the wedding, despite her rules. But now, these relics felt like a whisper from the past, intimate and haunting. Then came the second discovery. On the upper shelf, nestled behind an old jewelry box, was a small velvet container. Black, elegant, heavy. Inside lay a delicate set of black lace lingerie, clearly expensive, the kind Jasmine would never have bought for herself. A card was tucked into the lid, written in a bold, almost aggressive scrawl, "From T for you." No signature, no return address, no date. Just a first initial, T. Marcia sat down hard on the bed, box in hand, heart pounding. Who was T? And why had Jasmine kept this? Or had she ever even seen it? A new thought chilled her. What if this wasn't meant for Jasmine at all? What if Caleb had found it first? The handwriting, the tone, the timing, it was all wrong. And suddenly she remembered the necklace, the one she'd glimpsed earlier that day, dangling from the neck of the man Jonas had scolded. It had letters. She hadn't seen them clearly, but there had been a T, possibly an O, Trey Ortiz. The name hovered in her mind like smoke. She boxed the lingerie separately, labeled everything carefully, Jasmine's clothes, Caleb's items, unknown items, and stacked them near the front door. Then she picked up the phone and called the number Detective Marquez had left on her card. "Detective," she said, voice steady despite the rising tightness in her throat. "I found something. A few things, actually. You might want to see them." The detective arrived 30 minutes later, alone, in an unmarked vehicle. She stepped inside with quiet authority, her eyes scanning the room like a camera lens. Marcia showed her everything, room by room, item by item. When Elena opened the velvet box and saw the lingerie and card, her expression sharpened. "Do you recognize the name or the handwriting?" "No," Marcia said, "but earlier today, outside the Hart estate, I saw a young man arguing with Jonas. He wore a chain necklace, big letters. I think I saw AT and an O. Jonas ripped it off him and shoved him into Richard's car. They left in a hurry." Elena nodded slowly. "We're compiling a list of people connected to the Harts. If this Trey is who I think he is, your sighting might be critical." "He's not just connected," Marcia said, voice flat. "He's dangerous. I saw the way Jonas looked at him, like he'd messed up something important." The detective stood, carefully placing the box into an evidence bag. "We'll get a handwriting analyst on this, and I'll have the shop it came from traced. High-end boutiques sometimes keep purchase records." "You think Caleb saw it?" Marcia whispered. "Maybe that's why." "Maybe," Elena replied. "Or maybe it was never meant for Jasmine at all." They stood in silence. Outside, the late afternoon sun poured gold through the windows, casting long shadows across Jasmine's bed. "I can't shake the feeling," Marcia said finally, "that someone's still hiding something. That Richard Hart didn't look surprised at all." Elena nodded. "He didn't, but people like him, they're used to control. They've had years to rewrite the narrative. What they don't expect is for ghosts to float back up to the surface." "She's not a ghost," Marcia said firmly. "She was my daughter. And she didn't run. I knew it then. I know it now. A mother's intuition," Elena said with a small smile. "It never dies." As the detective stepped out the door with the evidence in hand, Marcia followed her to the porch. She watched the car drive away, her fists clenched at her sides. For 13 years, she'd been the only one keeping Jasmine's memory alive. Now, finally, the world was starting to catch up. The truth was close. She could feel it in her bones like a coming storm. And this time, she wasn't letting it slip away. Detective Elena Marquez sat behind her desk at the Savannah Police Department, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, staring at the velvet box sealed in an evidence bag. The lingerie inside, elegant and unsettling, whispered of a story just beneath the surface, one of secrets, jealousy, and manipulation. The bold handwriting on the card, "From T for you," was now the focal point of her investigation, and she didn't like the implications. She had seen it before, or something very close to it. While Marcia Bell's pain was raw and honest, Richard Hart's reactions remained unnervingly composed, his eyes sharp, calculating, too measured for a man who had just found his son's wedding car submerged in a swamp. Elena trusted patterns, and Richard was becoming a pattern of deflection, not grief. That morning, she visited Savannah Luxe, the boutique embossed on the inner tag of the lingerie. It was an upscale, private appointment-only shop tucked between two galleries in the historic district. The sales associate, a perfectly polished woman named Lizette, wrinkled her nose when Elena flashed her badge, but ultimately complied. "Yes," she said, flipping through a ledger of handwritten appointments and invoices from 1985. "That piece came from our Valentine's collection. It was special order." "Who purchased it?" Elena asked. "T. Ortiz," Lizette replied, scanning the page. Paid cash, but used his name for the custom card. We monogram gift cards unless requested otherwise. It's our signature touch. Elena's pen paused. Ortiz. First name? Trey. He was young, early 20s maybe, handsome, a little intense if I recall correctly. Do you remember who the recipient was? No, Lizette said, her tone clipped. We don't record that. We simply write what the buyer gives us, but it was clear the item was romantic. Or maybe manipulative. Elena raised an eyebrow. Manipulative? Lizette shrugged. The way he lingered over the card, as if he was trying to say something without actually saying it. I remember thinking, this isn't a gift, it's bait. Elena filed that away. She returned to the station and cross-referenced local addresses. It didn't take long to connect Trey Ortiz to Jonas Ortiz, longtime employee of the Hart family. Jonas had worked as Richard's personal driver and security assistant since 1982. No criminal record, but a sealed file tied to an internal company investigation in 1986 raised red flags. The report was thin, vague, employee misconduct during an out-of-state company retreat. No charges, no victim named. Elena leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Pieces were forming. Trey Ortiz, son of Jonas, bought seductive lingerie in early 1985. Jasmine never wore it. Instead, it was found hidden in Caleb's closet, still in pristine condition, never even removed from the box. So, how did it get there? And why had no one mentioned Trey until now? Across town, in the gilded silence of the Hart estate, Ethan Hart sat in his brother's old room, boxes scattered around him, the late afternoon light slanting through tall windows. Sylvia Hart hovered in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes tracing the same patterns on the rug she'd memorized years ago. I didn't know this room still smelled like him, she whispered. Ethan didn't look up. It's like he never left. But the truth is, none of us ever let him. He lifted a framed photo from the shelf. Caleb and Jasmine, arms around each other, eyes radiant. It didn't look posed. It looked real. He loved her, Mom, Ethan said. That wasn't fake. That wasn't rebellion. It was something stronger than anything Dad ever built in his empire. Sylvia exhaled shakily. I know that now. Her voice cracked. I just wish I'd seen it then. Ethan handed her the velvet box Marcia had delivered earlier. This was found in his closet. Sylvia opened it slowly, the lace catching the sunlight like spider webs. She read the card, her face paling. This wasn't Jasmine's style. I think someone was trying to drive a wedge between them, Ethan said. Maybe make Caleb jealous. Maybe make Jasmine look unfaithful. Sylvia's lips pressed together. Your father always said perception was more powerful than truth. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Ethan went downstairs to find Marcia standing there, holding another box, this one labeled Caleb Hart Personal Items. Her hands were shaking. I thought you might want these, she said. Some of them might help Elena. Sylvia appeared behind her son, eyes soft. Thank you, Marcia. Don't thank me yet, Marcia said. I saw your husband's driver shove a man into your Mercedes yesterday. He wore a chain with the initials T.O. I think he's the one who bought that. She pointed at the box Sylvia still held. That man, Trey Ortiz, was sent to destroy Jasmine's relationship before it even began. Sylvia's expression faltered. Why would he do that? Because someone told him to. Ethan stepped aside, letting Marcia in. You need to see something. He led her upstairs, back into Caleb's room, where another discovery awaited. Tucked into the bottom drawer of Caleb's desk, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a set of photos. Jasmine at work, Jasmine laughing with friends, Jasmine walking alone to her car, all taken from a distance. None of them known to have been taken by Caleb. Marcia's fingers trembled as she flipped through them. This is stalking. They were trying to build a case, Ethan said grimly, to paint her as someone unstable, maybe unfaithful, maybe dangerous. Marcia's eyes burned. They wanted to destroy her before she could taint their legacy. Sylvia sank into the nearest chair, silent tears streaking her cheeks. Richard would never, she began, but stopped. The words didn't ring true, even to her own ears. Ethan met Marcia's gaze. We need to give this to Detective Marquez, all of it, right now. Agreed, Marcia said. And then we find out how deep this really goes. As they packed the box for evidence, the late sun cast a final golden beam across the room. Caleb's presence lingered, not just in the photos or the scent of his cologne, but in the tension that filled the air, the quiet sense that a story once silenced was finally beginning to speak. And the velvet box, once meant to seduce or deceive, had become something else entirely. It had become the key Marcia Bell stood by the front gate of the Hart estate, her fingers tightening on the box of Caleb's belongings as the afternoon sun shimmered against the manicured hedges and cream-colored facade. The house loomed behind her like a monument to silence and status, yet nothing about it felt solid anymore, only fragile masks beginning to crack. As she opened the trunk of her car, she heard voices, low, hurried, near the driveway. She paused. A sleek black Mercedes had just pulled in, engine still running. Beside it stood Jonas, the longtime driver she'd seen many times from a distance, always polite, always invisible. But this time, he was speaking in clipped, urgent tones to a man in his early 30s, stocky, restless, wearing a white shirt unbuttoned at the neck and a thick gold chain swinging against his chest. Marcia's heart skipped. The man kept glancing around, rubbing his hands together, then stuffing them into his pockets. As she adjusted her angle behind the trunk lid, the chain glinted again, and there it was, a large gold pendant with two unmistakable letters crafted in ornate script, "To Trey Ortiz." Jonas's hand suddenly shot out and grabbed the necklace, yanking it toward him. "Boss said don't wear this," he hissed. "Not around here." "It's mine," the younger man snapped, trying to pull back. "That don't matter," Jonas barked, voice low but laced with steel. "You want him to dump you like garbage? You take this off." He tore the chain from Trey's neck and shoved it into his own pocket. Trey stumbled backward, jaw clenched. "You think he'll protect you forever?" Jonas stepped forward, towering. "Get in the car." Trey hesitated. For a second, Marcia saw something crack across his face. Fear, or maybe defiance. Then Jonas's hand clamped around his arm and practically dragged him toward the Mercedes. They disappeared inside, and the car pulled away with a sharp turn that left dust swirling in the sunlight. Marcia didn't move. Her breath was shallow, her pulse fast. She'd heard boss before, and she'd seen that necklace. Every part of her mother's intuition screamed, that man is connected to Jasmine. She grabbed her keys, slammed the trunk, and made a decision. She wouldn't go home, not yet. Instead, she turned the ignition and began to follow. She kept two cars between herself and the Mercedes, weaving through Savannah's historic district, the live oaks casting broken shadows across the cobblestone streets. They headed downtown first, past the courthouse, past the riverfront, past the newly built towers where old warehouses once stood. Then the car turned south, accelerating onto the highway. Marcia followed, her palms damp against the steering wheel, every mile pulling her closer not just to answers, but to danger. 20 minutes later, they arrived. Whitmore Industries, the same corporate building Richard had funded, branded, and ruled over like a modern-day monarch. Marcia parked across the street, watching from behind a parked delivery van. Jonas exited the car, handing over keys to a valet. Trey followed, looking around nervously. Both men disappeared into the glass lobby. For a moment, all was still. But then, a shift. A door on the side of the building opened. Richard Hart emerged, still in his tailored suit, but his gait quicker, sharper, less composed. He was already reaching into his jacket for keys. Jonas reappeared, handed something over. A brief exchange. Then Trey got back into the Mercedes, now in the passenger seat. Richard took the wheel. A minute later, they pulled back onto the road, this time heading south. And Marcia, breath held, followed again. They drove deeper into rural Georgia, past farmland, motels, and gas stations that hadn't changed since the 1980s. After another 15 miles, Richard's car veered off onto a winding road lined with pines. Marcia's stomach turned as she recognized the entrance, Okefenokee Swamp, the same road she had taken just days before to identify the Camaro. But this time, they didn't stop at the ranger station. They drove deeper, beyond the public trails, past the visitor center, until they parked near a less-used access path, marked only by a weather-worn sign that read, Long Pine Ridge. She parked discreetly behind a camper van and waited. A minute later, the two men exited the car and disappeared into the trees. Marcia waited 60 seconds. Then she got out, grabbed a park brochure, and followed. She stayed well behind, moving slowly, pretending to be a solo tourist snapping photos. Her shoes crunched on gravel, the humid air thick around her like a second skin. The trail grew narrower. The landscape changed. Marsh turned to rock, water gave way to limestone. Then she saw them, standing in a clearing, shaded by pine and brush, isolated and deadly quiet. Richard's voice was low but forceful. You show me the exact spot. Trey hesitated. Then he walked forward and pointed at a dense patch of ground. Here, 6 feet down. Like you said, took us hours. But we got through the limestone. Marcia pressed herself behind a boulder, heart pounding. She couldn't look away. We need to be ready, Richard said, scanning the trees. If the cops come back, we'll say you were some jealous ex. Make it clean. What about me? Trey asked, voice cracking. You said you'd help me disappear. You said I'd get something. You get 2 choices, Richard snapped. 1, vanish. New name, new state, and not a cent from me. Or 2, confess. Say you killed them out of jealousy. Say you buried the bodies, sank the car, take the hit, and in return, I put $300,000 in an offshore account for your mother. Trey's lips parted. You serious? More serious than your stupid lingerie stunt, Richard growled. That card had your name. If Caleb hadn't found it, you said to make it look real, not traceable, you idiot. Silence. Then Trey nodded. Okay, I'll do it. Good. Richard's voice dropped lower. Now let's go. We've stayed too long. Marcia didn't move, not even when they passed within 30 feet of her hiding spot. She waited until their footsteps faded. Then, hands trembling, she pulled out her phone. There were only 2 bars of signal, but that was enough. She called Detective Elena Marquez. Detective, she whispered, voice thin with urgency. I'm at Long Pine Ridge. I followed Richard Hart and a man named Trey Ortiz. I heard everything. He confessed. They buried Jasmine here. They're covering it up. Please, come now. On the other end, the detective's voice sharpened. Stay hidden. I'm on my way. Marcia hung up. She stared at the spot Trey had pointed to. Beneath that unmarked soil, her daughter had been waiting in silence. For 13 years. But not anymore. The necklace had given her a name, and the name had led to the truth. Marcia crouched behind the limestone ridge, her body rigid with adrenaline as the last echo of Richard Hart's voice faded into the trees. The air around her was thick with the heat of late afternoon, and the quiet violence of truth finally unearthed. The spot Trey had pointed to looked like any other patch of overgrown brush and pine needles, innocent to the unknowing eye. But to Marcia, it pulsed, it breathed, it screamed. That soil was her daughter's final cradle, carved into the earth by betrayal and buried by silence. She clutched her phone, her knuckles white as Detective Marquez's voice crackled back to life. We're coming in from the North Ranger Station, she said, low and focused. Do not move. Do not make a sound. We're 30 minutes out. Repeat, stay hidden. Marcia whispered her acknowledgement, then tucked the phone into her pocket and tried to still the tremor in her legs. Every muscle in her body screamed to run, to dig, to tear the earth open with her bare hands and hold Jasmine one last time. But she waited. The sky darkened by degrees, shadows stretching over the rocks like fingers. Minutes passed like hours. Then the quiet cracked. A distant rumble. Vehicles approaching over gravel. Then doors. Radios. Voices clipped and professional. Blue uniforms among the trees. Marcia stood, hands raised slightly, emerging from her hiding place like a ghost released from stone. She's here, she said, voice hoarse. Right where he said. Detective Marquez led the team, her face drawn, jaw locked. Get ground-penetrating radar in this zone, she ordered, pointing toward the patch Trey had marked. Clear 10 feet in each direction. I want soil samples, fiber collection, everything. As the team swarmed the clearing, Marcia stepped aside. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the base of a pine tree, eyes locked on the brush. Elena approached, kneeling beside her. What you did was dangerous, she said softly, and brave. I had to know, Marcia replied. All these years, they made me feel crazy, like Jasmine just left. Elena looked out at the search team. They always say that. They always want us to believe the women left. 20 feet away, a low beep pulsed from the radar, then another. A technician raised his hand. We've got anomaly detection, he said. Roughly 6 feet down, consistent density for partial human remains. 2 sets. Elena stood instantly. We dig now. Bring in the forensic coroner. Marcia buried her face in her hands, sobbing not from shock, but from release. Jasmine was here, and so was Caleb. They hadn't run. They hadn't vanished into irresponsibility or recklessness or fantasy. They'd been taken. Their love had been punished. Their lives extinguished under the boots of wealth, control, and a father's toxic pride. 30 minutes later, the remains were recovered. The 2 bodies, skeletal, intertwined, one with a gold band still clinging to a finger. A wedding ring. Caleb's. Marcia stood over the open bags as the coroner whispered blessings and zipped them shut. "Can I—" she began, then stopped. Elena touched her arm. "Not tonight," she said gently, "but soon." They escorted Marcia to a cruiser. She looked back only once. Behind her, a yellow tape flapped in the humid breeze. The pines stood tall and indifferent, as they had for 13 years. But the silence had broken. The truth had made itself known. Back at the ranger station, Trey Ortiz sat in the back of a patrol vehicle, his hands cuffed, sweat pooling along his collar. He refused to speak, refused to look anyone in the eye. Richard Hart, on the other hand, paced beside his lawyer, barking accusations of entrapment, slander, and unlawful pursuit. Elena approached him slowly. "We found your son's wedding ring on the male remains," she said calmly, "right next to the lingerie card your associate signed. The same one that matches handwriting from a Savannah Lux purchase record. Do you want to change your statement?" Richard's mouth moved, but no words came out. "No," Elena continued. "Then maybe you can explain the necklace, the one with your associate's initials, or how your driver Jonas Ortiz's name appears on multiple company expense reports from the week Jasmine and Caleb disappeared, including a hotel 2 miles from the murder site." His lawyer stepped in. No further comments. "Of course," Elena said, nodding. "We'll let the forensic evidence speak for you." As Richard turned away, he caught Marcia's gaze through the station window. For a brief second, their eyes locked, hers burning with righteous fury, his flinching with the realization that something had slipped beyond his control. The next morning, news of the discovery broke across Georgia like wildfire. Bodies of missing wedding couple found after 13 years. Hart Air linked to cover-up blared across headlines. Ethan Hart called Marcia personally. "I'm sorry," he said, "and thank you. If you hadn't followed them—" "Your father buried the truth," Marcia replied. "But my daughter didn't die invisible. Not anymore." That afternoon, the forensics lab confirmed the DNA matches. Jasmine Bell and Caleb Hart, murdered and buried in the Okefenokee swamp. The charges against Trey and Richard were formalized: obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit murder, destruction of evidence. But Elena suspected more would come. Jonas Ortiz had disappeared. A nationwide manhunt began. Marcia stood in Jasmine's old room that night, the sun casting soft gold over the dustless furniture. She opened the box of her daughter's keepsakes and found her journal. The last entry was dated the morning of the wedding. "No matter where life takes us, I'll go there with him. Not because he gave me an expensive ring or a fancy name, but because when I look at Caleb, I see the life I want to build, side by side. Just us." Marcia closed the book, holding it to her chest. And for the first time in 13 years, she allowed herself to grieve not the disappearance, but the loss. Jasmine had loved. Jasmine had hoped. Jasmine had fought for a future she never got to see. But now, she had a name. She had a place. She had the truth. And soon, she would have justice. The walls of the interrogation room were the color of storm clouds, and the single overhead light buzzed faintly, casting a pallid glow across the scratched metal table at its center. Detective Elena Marquez sat on one side, her expression unreadable, a manila folder closed neatly before her. Across from her, Trey Ortiz sat in silence, arms shackled to the table, his eyes fixed on a scuff mark near his foot, as if it held the power to save him. A second chair remained empty, deliberately. Elena had learned long ago that silence was louder than any threat. "Trey," she said finally, voice calm, measured, "you told Richard you'd take the fall for everything. That you'd say it was jealousy. That you killed both of them." Trey didn't move, didn't blink. She leaned forward. "We have the purchase receipt from Savannah Lux, the card, the handwriting match. You used your real name, Trey. That lingerie wasn't a gift. It was a trap." Still no response. Elena reached into the folder, sliding out a glossy photograph and placing it in front of him. "We found your fingerprints on the velvet box," she continued. "We found your shoe impressions at the burial site. And we have a statement from Marcia Bell, who heard everything you and Richard said in the clearing." Trey's jaw clenched. She was eavesdropping. She was watching the man who murdered her daughter, Elena replied evenly. "We also recovered surveillance footage from the Hart estate gate, security cams Richard didn't know we accessed. You were there. You entered with Jonas. You left with Richard. You followed him to the swamp." Trey shifted. Slightly. The beginning of a crack. Elena pressed. "Tell me what happened, Trey. Don't let Richard hang this around your neck. You're not the only one who's going to prison, but you have a choice about how you get there. Trey finally raised his eyes, and for the first time since his arrest, they held something other than defiance. They held fear. He said I wouldn't have to be involved, he whispered. Said I just had to send the lingerie, get in her head, make the boyfriend jealous. That's Caleb, Elena reminded him. Say his name. Caleb, Trey repeated, quieter. But Caleb didn't take the bait. He wasn't like the others. He didn't accuse her. He defended her. They left before we could act. So Richard changed the plan. He told Jonas to follow them to Dania Beach. Told me to go too. Said we'd scare her, make her leave Caleb. I didn't know. He stopped. Elena waited. I didn't know Jonas was going to kill her, Trey said, voice cracking. I thought we'd maybe rough her up, fake a robbery. That's what he told me, that it looked like an accident. But it wasn't, Elena said. Trey nodded slowly. Jonas hit her. Too hard. She fell. She didn't get up. I panicked. I wanted to run, but Jonas said we had to finish it. Said if Caleb saw anything, we'd be dead men. And then Caleb walked in. Trey swallowed hard. He started yelling. Tried to call the cops. Jonas attacked him. I tried to pull him off, but it was too late. There was so much blood. Elena didn't flinch. What did Richard do when you told him? He wasn't surprised, Trey murmured. He arranged everything. The boat, the tarp, the drive out to the swamp. He even picked the burial site. Said it was the deepest part. No one would find them. Elena nodded. But someone did. She closed the file and stood. Thank you for confirming what we already knew. She opened the door and gestured to an officer. Take him back. As Trey was led away, Elena turned toward the adjacent observation room, where Marcia stood behind the one-way glass. Her face was pale but composed, her arms folded tightly across her chest. You okay? Elena asked gently. Marcia nodded, though her voice came out brittle. It's different, hearing it from him, hearing how casually they planned her death. We're going to get them all, Marcia, Elena said. Every last one. In the next room, Richard Hart sat alone. No cuffs, no sweat, just stillness, as if he were waiting to be served coffee instead of a murder indictment. His lawyer had arrived earlier but been denied the room. Richard had waived counsel for the preliminary interview. Arrogance, Elena thought, or something darker. She entered the room and sat across from him. We've recovered both bodies, she said without preamble. We've confirmed identities, cause of death, burial method. We have video placing you with Trey. We have Trey's testimony. And we have the key you dropped, labeled with Trey's name, which you claimed not to know. Richard said nothing. She leaned forward. You're going to prison, Richard. You're going to die in a cell. The only question now is whether you make that death faster and cleaner or slower and messier. Still silence. Elena smiled slightly. You know the most interesting thing about power, Richard? It only works if other people agree you have it. She stood. Right now, no one does. When she left, Richard's jaw was locked so tight his cheek twitched. He stared at the closed door, and for the first time, he looked old. Truly old. Outside, Marcia waited by the vending machine, a bottle of water in hand, her posture straighter than it had been in years. Elena joined her. He won't talk, she said. Not yet. Marcia nodded. He thinks silence is still power. And he's wrong. Yes, Marcia said, eyes hard. Because Jasmine isn't silent anymore. The hallway stretched ahead of them, bright with artificial light and the quiet hum of justice awakening from a long, bitter sleep. The rain had started just after midnight, a gentle curtain over Savannah's stone walkways and iron fences, soft enough to feel reverent, almost as if the city itself was mourning what it had long ignored. Detective Elena Marquez stood beneath the awning of the Hart family columbarium, a private memorial house tucked behind the estate's gardens, accessible only by a heavy black iron gate and a key that Richard Hart had dropped during his arrest. The tag attached to that key, handwritten in fading ink, read, OIS Vault 3. The implication had hung in the air like smoke. Marcia Bell stood beside her now, holding a small umbrella and wearing the same coat she'd worn when she buried her husband 15 years ago. But this was different. This wasn't a funeral. This was a reclamation. Ethan Hart arrived moments later, face drawn, his mother Sylvia close behind him. Neither spoke. Elena held the key out. Mr. Hart, you said this door was never accessed by anyone but your father. He kept it locked always, Ethan said, voice quiet. Told us it was reserved for legacy clients. He was obsessed with legacy. Elena turned the key. The lock clicked. Solid, unyielding for a breath, then surrendered. The door creaked open, revealing a corridor lined with marble niches, brass nameplates, and floral arrangements long past their prime. The scent was of cold stone and dead flowers. Elena led the group down the hall, scanning each name. Vault 1, Vault 2, then, finally, Vault 3. It was smaller than the others, unlit. A single light bulb dangled from the ceiling, its pull chain swaying slightly from the change in air pressure. The walls were bare, save for one niche at the far end. Unlike the others, it bore no nameplate, no date, no inscription, just a sealed brass container set deep into the wall. Elena turned. Marcia, you don't have to see this part. But Marcia stepped forward. I've waited 13 years. I'll see it through. Ethan moved beside her. Me too. Elena nodded at the forensic techs, who had just arrived, their gloves already on. One approached the niche with a small drill, the sound piercing and precise. It took only minutes before the front plate came loose. Inside sat a simple black urn, matte finish, unlabeled, but unmistakably modern. The tech handed it carefully to Elena. She looked to Marcia. We'll confirm it through DNA, but I believe this is Caleb. Marcia nodded. Her fingers grazed the urn's surface. He died trying to protect her. And his father hid him like a tax receipt, Ethan said bitterly. Sylvia let out a breath that wasn't quite a sob. He told me it was an investor's remains, she whispered. Said it was confidential, that the client wanted anonymity. Elena turned to her. How long has it been here? Since 1985, she said. Maybe early 86. I never questioned it. You trusted him, Marcia said, not unkindly. We all did. Until it cost us everything. Outside, the rain thickened, smearing the garden lights into halos of gold. The techs resealed the vault, documenting every angle, every step. Elena stood in the doorway for a moment longer, then closed the columbarium with the same key, handing it to the officer beside her. Chain of custody begins now. As they walked back to the house, Ethan turned to Marcia. There's something else you should know. What is it? I went into Dad's office this morning before we came here. There's a drawer he always kept locked. I remembered the sound of the key. It's not on the key ring anymore, but I found a backup in the basement. He reached into his jacket and produced a small envelope. Inside were half a dozen photographs, grainy, time-worn, but unmistakable. Jasmine on the beach, Jasmine reading under a tree, Jasmine walking with Caleb, mid-laugh, all taken from a distance. He had someone watching them, Ethan said. Maybe Trey. Maybe someone else. These weren't public photos. These were surveillance. Marcia took the envelope, her fingers stiff. He built a case against her, like she was some threat. Because to him, Ethan said, she was. At the station later that evening, Elena placed the urn on the evidence table, tagging it carefully. The lab would test the contents, but none of them doubted what it would reveal. Caleb Hart's body, cremated, mislabeled, hidden under a false identity in his father's private mausoleum. She returned to her desk, flipping through the case file. With Trey's testimony, the forensic matches, the photographs, and now the urn, the case was no longer circumstantial. It was complete. Richard Hart wasn't just complicit. He was the architect. And the weight of that legacy would follow him into every courtroom and every cell for the rest of his life. In her apartment that night, Marcia sat alone, the urn placed gently on a towel before her, a candle burning beside it. Jasmine and Caleb, together in death, as they had fought to be in life. She whispered prayers, she whispered forgiveness, she whispered names. Outside, the rain softened, tapering into quiet, and the city, for the first time in 13 years, felt like it was listening. The courtroom buzzed like a hive just before the storm, cameras flashing, reporters murmuring, spectators clutching programs that read State of Georgia v. Richard Hart. It had taken less than 6 weeks to bring the case to trial, an unusually swift process propelled by overwhelming evidence, mounting public pressure, and the profile of the man at its center. Richard Hart sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit flanked by 2 attorneys, his once imposing presence diminished beneath the fluorescent courtroom lights. His silver hair, usually meticulously styled, had dulled to the color of ash, and his expression, though carefully neutral, betrayed the tension coiled beneath his skin. In the gallery sat Sylvia Hart, pale and motionless beside her son Ethan. whose jaw clenched tighter with each passing moment. Just a few rows behind them, Marcia Bell held a small pendant Jasmine had once worn, an amber stone set in silver, cupped in her palm like a prayer. She hadn't spoken to Richard since the day she watched him led from the swamp in handcuffs, but she had looked him in the eye once that morning as he was escorted into the courtroom. He didn't flinch, but he didn't hold her gaze either. The prosecution wasted no time. They led with evidence, satellite imagery from the Okefenokee, sonar maps, photographs of the Camaro, the burial site, the columbarium. Then came the forensic report. Confirmed identities of the victims, cause of death, likely blunt force trauma and asphyxiation, consistent with being struck and suffocated. Trey Ortiz testified on day 3. He entered the courtroom in a jumpsuit, hands shackled, eyes sunken, voice trembling. But what he said was clear, direct, and devastating. He spoke of being recruited, of being manipulated, of how Richard had turned him into a weapon disguised as a messenger. He described the lingerie, the photographs, the stalking, the orders to intimidate and isolate Jasmine until Caleb doubted her. When that failed, he testified, the plan shifted to elimination. The jury sat frozen, each detail sinking like ice into their veins. The courtroom gasped when he described how Jonas Ortiz, under Richard's instructions, had killed Jasmine during a staged robbery, and how Caleb had walked in, seen it all, and tried to call for help before being silenced as well. The burial, the disposal, the payments, the secrecy, the legacy. On day 4, Detective Elena Marquez took the stand. Her presence was unwavering, her voice calm and authoritative as she walked the jury through the timeline, the chain of evidence, and the moment she opened Vault 3 and found Caleb's remains, hidden for 13 years beneath a false identity. This wasn't a crime of passion, she said. This was a calculation, a cover-up that began the day they died and was maintained for over a decade. Richard Hart didn't just bury his son. He buried the truth. When it was Marcia Bell's turn, the courtroom fell into a hush that felt like mourning. She stood at the witness stand, hands clasped, eyes steady. "My daughter was kind," she began, her voice clear but full of raw gravity. She sang in the church choir. She volunteered at the community clinic. She worked 2 jobs to help me pay for nursing school. She loved Caleb, and I believe with everything in me that he loved her too. She looked straight at Richard. "Your son died defending my daughter, and you didn't just let it happen. You arranged it. You buried them. And then you let me suffer for 13 years, telling the world she ran away, that she was unstable, that she was a liar." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You stole my child, but you didn't silence her. You only delayed her justice." Some jurors wiped tears. Others stared at Richard, whose jaw twitched, his stare locked on the table in front of him. No rebuttal was offered. No cross-examination dared to challenge her. And the final witness was Ethan. "He didn't want my brother to marry her," he said simply, "because Jasmine came from a different world, a world my father thought didn't belong next to ours. But Caleb chose her anyway. And because he chose love, my father chose murder." The defense argued duress, tried to paint Trey and Jonas as rogue actors. They questioned the validity of surveillance photos, downplayed the meaning of the key, and emphasized Richard's grief. But it was hollow. Everything about it sounded rehearsed, desperate, like a man clinging to a version of reality he could no longer buy. On the 8th day, the jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the 4 women stood and, with a voice trembling under the weight of finality, declared Richard Hart guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and illegal disposal of human remains. A sob broke from Sylvia's chest. Ethan closed his eyes. Richard sat perfectly still. The judge set sentencing for the following week. As the courtroom cleared, Marcia stepped outside, breathing in air she felt she hadn't tasted in years. The world looked different now. Not kinder, but cleaner. Honest. She didn't know if healing would come, but the wound was no longer hidden. As reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, Marcia declined every interview. She didn't want her daughter's name on sound bites. She wanted it on headstones, memorials, and memory. In the parking lot, Elena joined her. "He'll never leave prison," she said. "You gave her a voice, Marcia." "She always had one," Marcia whispered. "The world just stopped listening." That night, in a quiet corner of Laurel Grove Cemetery, 2 graves were prepared side by side. one for Jasmine, one for Caleb. After 13 years buried in silence, they would finally rest above the earth, in light, in names, and in peace. The morning sun filtered softly through the moss-draped oaks of Laurel Grove Cemetery, casting long golden beams across the dew-covered grass, as if nature itself were bowing in reverence. A quiet breeze rustled the leaves above, not loud enough to disturb the silence, but just enough to remind those gathered that this was a sacred hour, one long overdue. Two caskets stood side by side beneath the white canopy. One engraved with Jasmine Alana Bell, the other Caleb James Hart. For the first time in 13 years, their names were no longer whispered in grief or cloaked in scandal. They were carved into stone, visible, undeniable, belonging. Rows of white chairs fanned out around the gravesite, occupied by old neighbors, childhood friends, former teachers, and strangers who had followed every word of the trial and come to pay their respects. Among them were faces from both sides of Savannah. Those who had once turned away from Marcia Bell in hushed judgment now sat in contrition, heads bowed. At the front, Marcia clutched a folded handkerchief in one hand and a photograph in the other. Jasmine in her prom dress, standing beside Caleb under a crepe myrtle tree, both laughing as if the world would never turn cruel. She had not slept the night before. She had ironed the same black blouse 5 times, but now, as the service began and the pastor spoke of justice and grace, of pain and peace, she felt a stillness settle in her bones. Detective Elena Marquez stood nearby, not in uniform, but in a navy suit, her badge tucked away. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her presence alone was a symbol that the law could bend, but it could also correct. Ethan Hart stood across from her, his hand on his mother Sylvia's back. Sylvia looked older than ever, her features gaunt and hands shaking slightly. But she held a single lily in her palm and stared at Caleb's casket with something like maternal sorrow, a regret so deep it no longer needed words. The pastor finished his remarks, and silence fell like a blanket over the crowd. Then Ethan stepped forward. "My brother," he began, voice steady but soft, "was not a saint, but he was brave. He fell in love with someone he wasn't supposed to love, not because she wasn't worthy, but because the world we lived in told him she wasn't allowed. He fought that. And because he did, he died with honor. For love." He paused, looking at Marcia. "And Jasmine? She was light. My father hated her not because of who she was, but because he knew the truth. She was better than the legacy he tried to leave behind." He stepped back. Marcia rose slowly, walking toward the podium. The crowd quieted further, if such a thing was possible. 13 years ago I buried my daughter in memory," she said. "Today I lay her to rest in truth." She looked toward the 2 caskets. They found each other in life, and they never let go, even in death. This isn't just a funeral. This is a correction, a restoration, a declaration that what was done in darkness has now been brought into the light. She stepped forward, placed the photograph between the 2 coffins, and kissed her fingertips before pressing them gently to Jasmine's casket. As she returned to her seat, birds began to chirp in the distance. A quiet, spontaneous chorus that seemed both out of place and perfectly timed. The burial was slow, deliberate, as the coffins were lowered into the earth together. The first shovelful of soil was cast by Marcia, her hand trembling but her resolve firm. Ethan followed, then Sylvia, then Elena. One by one, mourners approached, dropping lilies, notes, and roses onto the caskets below, until the graves were a tapestry of white and red and green. After the service, no one rushed to leave. People stood in circles, spoke softly, cried openly. The media stayed at the cemetery gates, respectful for once. Elena found Marcia standing alone at the foot of the graves. "You did what mothers aren't supposed to have to do," she said gently. "You carried her memory alone. Now you don't have to." Marcia nodded, not trusting her voice. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a necklace, Jasmine's favorite, the one she'd been wearing the night she disappeared. It had been returned to Marcia during evidence processing. Now, she knelt and buried it in the soil above her daughter's casket, a final offering. "She never had a wedding," Marcia whispered, "but she had love." Ethan appeared beside her, offering a tentative hand. "I'd like to help create a scholarship," he said, "in both their names, for kids like Jasmine. Bright, overlooked, unafraid." Marcia looked at him. "That would be a start." As the sky brightened and the canopy was packed away, 2 new headstones gleamed in the morning light. Beloved daughter, fierce heart, loyal son, gentle warrior. Names that once were lost now stood tall, permanent, sacred. And for the first time in over a decade, Savannah exhaled. It began not with an explosion, but with silence. The sentencing of Richard Hart was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Monday, but by 8 o'clock, the courthouse steps were already crowded with reporters, former clients, employees of Hart Equity, and families who had once trusted the empire that now teetered on the edge of collapse. The crowd buzzed like a charged wire, part anger, part relief, part disbelief that the man who had once owned half the commercial skyline of Savannah now faced a potential sentence of life without parole. Inside courtroom 6C, the atmosphere was different, sterile, thick, as though the air knew it was holding the weight of legacy and reckoning. Richard sat in the defendant's chair again, this time with a hollow look in his eyes. The performative confidence of earlier days now gone. His legal team, reduced from 6 to 2, barely spoke. Behind him, only 2 people had shown up from his personal life, an estranged cousin and his former COO, both looking more like attendees at a business funeral than supporters at sentencing. Judge Marlowe entered the room without flourish. She was a stern woman, known for her clarity and control, and today she carried herself like a conductor, approaching the final movement of a long, dark symphony. "Mr. Hart," she began, "you have been found guilty of crimes that spanned over a decade. Murder by proxy, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and manipulation of legal and financial systems to maintain your power. You orchestrated the deaths of 2 young people, not because they posed a threat to your safety, but to your legacy." Richard looked up at her with a tight jaw. No apology, no plea, just the faintest twitch in the corner of his mouth. "Before sentencing," Judge Marlowe continued, "we will hear 2 final statements from the victims' families." Marcia Bell rose first, stepping to the center of the courtroom with a poise that silenced every shifting foot and clicking camera. She looked directly at Richard. "You spent your life building walls," she said. "Walls of steel, of law, of lies. You called it business. You called it discipline. But really, you were just hiding. Hiding from the truth that your empire was never about strength. It was about fear. You were afraid of people like Jasmine, people who loved freely, people who didn't need your money to define them." Her voice didn't break, but her fingers trembled slightly as she added, "I don't want revenge. I want silence. I want to know that my daughter can finally rest, and that you will never again control another life with your cowardice." She stepped away. Ethan Hart took her place. He didn't look at his father. He looked at the judge. "I carry the Hart name," he said, "but I will not carry the Hart shame. I reject it. I disown it. Whatever good my father did is drowned beneath what he buried. He killed my brother, not with his hands, but with his decisions. And for that, he deserves to be forgotten, not remembered." Judge Marlowe let the silence stretch before she finally spoke. "Richard Langston Hart, the court hereby sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Additionally, your estate will be seized in accordance with federal asset forfeiture laws, and the Hart Equity Group will be dismantled and placed under independent receivership." A gasp went through the room. It wasn't just a sentence, it was the demolition of a dynasty. Richard's face finally cracked. His eyes flickered with something feral and stunned. For a man who had believed legacy would immortalize him, anonymity was the crueler punishment. 2 guards approached. He stood, wrists automatically extended. As they cuffed him and led him from the courtroom, he turned once, toward his son. "You'll regret this," he muttered. Ethan didn't blink. "No, Dad, I regret everything I learned from you." The door closed behind Richard, and it felt like a vacuum was released from the courthouse. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. Billionaire sentenced to life. Hart Empire dismantled. Stock tickers dropped. Ina's boardrooms panicked. Clients withdrew. But for the families who mattered, the ones who had waited in the shadows for so long, it wasn't about headlines. It was about closure. That evening, the Hart building downtown, once crowned with golden letters at its peak, was stripped of its name. Marcia watched from across the street, standing beside Ethan and Elena. "Funny," she said softly. "You spend your life building something, and it can vanish in a single night." "Some things deserve to," Ethan replied. Elena added, "And some things, like truth, take time, but they don't vanish. They wait." The 3 stood in the glow of a city recalibrating itself. No longer under Richard Hart's shadow. no longer tethered to his silence. And somewhere in the hush between traffic and city light, there was the faintest feeling that justice, real justice, had finally spoken. It had been 3 months since the trial ended, since Richard Hart disappeared into the depths of a federal penitentiary where no legacy could follow him. And in those 90 days, Savannah felt like a city breathing differently, slower, deeper, more aware. But for Marcia Bell, healing wasn't about justice delivered in a courtroom or headlines that faded within days. It was about small moments reclaiming their power, watering her daughter's favorite hydrangeas again, walking past Jasmine's high school without her chest tightening, finally opening the box of journals Jasmine left behind and reading her words aloud in an empty kitchen. Every line was a conversation rekindled. Every paragraph was a breath returned. She began organizing community vigils, not in protest, but in remembrance. Names of the lost, the voiceless, the unheard. Other mothers came. Other stories emerged. Not every wound could be prosecuted, but every story deserved to be spoken. One quiet afternoon, Marcia stood alone by her daughter's grave. The summer heat had mellowed, and the grass above the headstone had grown thick and even. She placed a fresh bouquet of stargazer lilies, Jasmine's favorite, then whispered something only the wind could carry. "You're not a secret anymore." Across town, Ethan Hart had left the gleaming towers behind. He'd sold the family estate, donated the proceeds to the new Hart Bell Memorial Scholarship, and moved into a modest apartment above a bookstore near the river. He no longer wore tailored suits. He wore denim, canvas, flannel, the uniform of someone rebuilding from the inside out. He now taught financial literacy at the local community center, using the same knowledge his father once weaponized to empower the young and overlooked. Each student reminded him of Caleb in some way, brilliant, impulsive, hopeful. One evening after class, Ethan received a package with no return label. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, weathered by time. Caleb's name was embossed in the corner. A note was tucked inside. "Found in a storage locker under his name. Thought it should be with you." He opened it and read the first line. "Jasmine told me not all storms come to destroy. Some come to clear the path. I think I believe her now." Ethan sat for hours, reading entries filled with poetry, frustration, love, and dreams of escape. For the first time, he truly met his brother, not just as the golden child or the rebel, but as a full, flawed, deeply feeling man who had wanted nothing more than to choose his own story. Across the street, in a quiet cafe where she had often done her stakeouts, Detective Elena Marquez sipped her tea and watched the river roll. Her superiors had offered her a commendation. She declined. Justice wasn't about medals. It was about the moments that haunted you until you did something about them. She had gone back to the swamp once, alone. No press, no team. Just her, a lantern, and the stillness of that place where Caleb had died. She knelt in the dirt, touched the earth, and whispered, "You mattered. You always did." A few weeks later, she requested transfer to the cold case division. When asked why, she simply replied, "Because silence has too many victims." At the edge of the city, the once iconic Hart headquarters was slowly being transformed. The glass lobby that once displayed trophies of corporate conquest now displayed portraits of community leaders, educators, and youth activists. The new nonprofit that replaced Hart Equity was named the Echo Foundation. Inspired by a line from Jasmine's journal, "Some voices are not gone. They just echo differently." On the first day it opened to the public, Marcia Bell was invited to cut the ribbon. She wore a soft lilac dress and a silver pin shaped like a musical note, Jasmine's. Ethan stood beside her, not as a Hart, but as someone finally free of that name. "You ready?" he asked. Marcia smiled. "We've been ready. The world just needed to catch up." As the doors opened, children ran in, music played softly from speakers, and a new chapter quietly began. That night, under the stars, Ethan visited Caleb's grave. He knelt and placed the journal beside the headstone. "You were right," he whispered. "She cleared the path. You both did." Nearby, Marcia lit a candle at Jasmine's headstone. The flame flickered gently in the breeze, and for the first time, in a long, long time, the city didn't feel haunted. It felt heard. Some stories are never meant to fade. They linger in the empty chairs at dinner tables, in the pages of forgotten journals, in the silence after a name is spoken. Jasmine and Caleb's story was stolen, buried beneath fear, pride, and power. But truth has a way of resurfacing, even after decades. And when it does, It doesn't just bring justice, it brings reckoning. At Nest Soul, we tell the stories of those who were silenced. We trace the shadows, unravel the lies, and remind the world that the forgotten are never truly gone. Because love doesn't vanish, it waits, and so do we. Until the next story, stay with us. This is Nest Soul.